The Montana winter of 1883 was unforgiving, but the letter arriving on the Wells Fargo stagecoach held a far colder promise. Gabe expected a quiet, obedient wife to share his impending ruin. Instead, a woman stepped off the carriage carrying a leather medical satchel, a loaded Remington, and a dangerous secret. The wind howling down the Bitterroot Mountains possessed teeth. It gnawed at the log beams of the Broken Ridge Ranch, a sprawling spread that had once been the envy of the valley, now reduced to a graveyard of ambitions. Gabe Montgomery stood on the porch, a towering silhouette of a mountain man clad in bear hide and denim. His beard was thick, his face weathered into deep crevices by sun, snow, and sorrow. He struck a match against the porch rail, cupping the flame to light his pipe, his slate-gray eyes fixed on the lower pasture. Down there, 3 more head of cattle lay dead in the frost. It was a mysterious blight. The locals called it the blood fever. It moved through herds like a silent thief, leaving the animals emaciated before they finally collapsed, their eyes hollow and hides swarming with strange, hard-shelled ticks. Gabe had spent the last 10 years carving this ranch out of the wilderness with his bare hands, fighting off predators and brutal winters, only to be brought to his knees by an invisible enemy. His ruin was closely monitored. Josiah Rutherford, a ruthless cattle baron operating out of Missoula, had been buying up dying ranches for pennies on the dollar. Rutherford's men had already paid Gabe 3 visits, the last ending with Gabe firing a Winchester rifle over their heads. But bullets couldn't kill a plague, and pride couldn't pay the bank. In a moment of profound, whiskey-fueled loneliness 6 months prior, Gabe had answered an advertisement in the Heart and Hand matrimonial paper. He had asked for a sturdy, practical woman to share a hard life. He hadn't expected an answer, much less a telegram from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency office in Chicago, forwarding a message that a Miss Saline Harding had accepted his proposal and was en route. Now, the rumble of the stagecoach wheels echoing through the valley meant there was no turning back. Gabe saddled his massive draft horse, Goliath, and led a pack mule down the rugged trail toward the small settlement of Stevensville. He felt a deep, twisting guilt. He was bringing a woman into a dying world. He had no wealth left to offer, only debts and dying livestock. When the Wells Fargo stagecoach finally pulled to a dusty halt outside the Mercantile, Gabe hung back, watching from the shadows of his wide-brimmed Stetson. The driver, an old-timer named Jeremiah, tossed 2 heavy, iron-reinforced trunks onto the dirt. Then, the heavy wooden door creaked open. Saline Harding did not look like a woman running toward a fairy tale. She stepped down with deliberate, grounded grace. She wore a dark wool traveling suit, tailored for endurance rather than fashion, though it couldn't hide a naturally striking figure. Her hair, the color of polished mahogany, was pinned back severely, but a few rebellious strands escaped to frame a face that was sharp, intelligent, and striking. Her eyes were a piercing, vibrant green, sweeping over the rough-hewn town with calculating precision. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't weeping for the comforts of the East. She was assessing. Gabe stepped forward, his massive frame parting the small crowd of onlookers. Saline's eyes locked onto his. She didn't flinch at his rugged, almost wild appearance. "Mr. Montgomery, I presume," she said, her voice clear and carrying a refined, yet steely cadence. "Miss Harding," Gabe replied, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble. He tipped his hat, feeling uncharacteristically self-conscious of the dirt beneath his fingernails. "You brought a lot of baggage for a woman seeking a simple life." Saline glanced at the heavy, padlocked trunks. "A woman must come prepared for the wilderness, Mr. Montgomery. A simple life rarely means an easy one." Gabe loaded her heavy trunks onto the mule, noting with a frown that they weighed far more than clothes and linens ought to. As he helped her onto the back of Goliath, his large hands gripping her waist, a sudden spark of awareness passed between them, a jolt of raw, unexpected chemistry that left Gabe momentarily breathless. She was soft but firm, and she smelled of lavender and something sharp, like carbolic soap. The ride back to the Broken Ridge was suffocatingly quiet. The towering pines closed in around them, casting long, chilling shadows. Gabe finally broke the silence. his conscience demanding he speak the truth before they reached the cabin. "I need to be plain with you, Celine," Gabe said, not looking back. "The letters I wrote you, they were true when I penned them. But things have changed. A sickness has taken my herd. The ranch is failing. I'm bleeding money, and there's a man named Rutherford waiting for me to bleed out so he can take the land. I ain't offering you a future anymore, just a front row seat to a funeral." He waited for the tears. He waited for her to demand he turn the horse around and put her back on the stagecoach. Instead, Celine shifted her weight, her arms wrapping just a fraction tighter around his waist to steady herself. "I did not come for your money, Gabe," she said quietly, her breath warm against his frozen buckskin jacket. "I came for the sanctuary of the mountains. And as for funerals, I have attended enough for one lifetime. We will see about your dying ranch." The first 2 weeks at the Broken Ridge Ranch were a delicate dance of boundaries and quiet revelations. Gabe, a man accustomed to the solitary rhythms of the mountains, found himself captivated by his new wife. Celine was a paradox. She could bake bread that tasted of heaven and mend a torn work shirt with invisible stitches, yet she requested to be shown how to fire his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle on her second day. She hit a tin can at 200 yards on her third try. Despite the growing, quiet affection between them, stolen glances across the hearth, the accidental brush of hands over the coffee pot that sent heat pooling in Gabe's gut, the shadow of ruin loomed heavy. The blood fever was accelerating. Every morning, Gabe rode out to the pastures, and every morning, he found more carcasses. He was a man who could track a grizzly through a blizzard, but he was utterly powerless against this microscopic enemy. It was breaking his spirit, turning him sullen and withdrawn. One brutally cold Tuesday, the crisis peaked. Gabe's prize-breeding bull, a massive roan named Thunder, collapsed near the watering hole. Thunder was the last hope for rebuilding the herd. Gabe stood over the gasping animal, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He drew his Colt revolver from his holster. Sparing the animal a slow, agonizing death was the only mercy left in his hands. He cocked the hammer, the metallic click echoing sharply in the crisp air. "Put the gun down, Gabe." He whipped his head around. Celine was marching down the snowy slope from the cabin. She wasn't wearing her apron. She was wearing a heavy wool coat, and in her gloved hand, she carried the small, locked leather satchel she had meticulously kept hidden beneath her bed since the day she arrived. "He's done for, Celine. You shouldn't be down here," Gabe warned, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "It's the fever. It's highly contagious to the herd." "It is not a fever, and it is not a curse," Celine snapped, dropping to her knees in the snow beside the massive, twitching bull. She didn't flinch at the mud or the sight of the dying animal. She snapped the lock on her satchel and pulled it open. Gabe stared in stunned silence. Inside, the satchel wasn't sewing gear or Bibles. It was lined with velvet and held a gleaming brass microscope, rows of glass vials, surgical steel scalpels, and leather-bound journals filled with meticulous, handwritten notes. "What in God's name is all that?" Gabe demanded, lowering his revolver. Celine pulled out a pair of iron tweezers and a small glass vial. "My real name is not Celine Harding," she said, her eyes intensely focused as she began to part the hair on the bull's neck, searching the hide. "It's Celine Miller. Does the name mean anything to you?" Gabe frowned, searching his memory. "Miller? Like the fella back east? The scientist the papers were calling a butcher?" "My father," Celine said, her voice tightening with a mix of pride and old grief. "Dr. Harrison Miller. He worked alongside Dr. Daniel Salmon in Washington, trying to prove that this Texas fever isn't carried by the air or bad water, but by a vector, a parasite." She found what she was looking for. With a swift motion, she plucked a swollen, blood-engorged tick from the bull's hide and dropped it into a glass vial, sealing it tight. They laughed at him. Celine continued, her hands moving rapidly as she drew a foul-smelling liquid from a large bottle in her bag into a heavy glass syringe. When the cattle barons realized his quarantine methods would cost them money and halt their cattle drives, they ruined him. They hired men to burn his laboratory. He died of a broken heart a month later. I was his lead assistant. I wrote half the papers they burned. Gabe watched, spellbound, as his mail-order bride, a woman he thought was a simple seamstress, expertly found a vein in the massive bull's neck and injected the dark liquid. Women aren't permitted to hold veterinary licenses or work in the Bureau of Animal Industry, Celine said, finally looking up at Gabe, her green eyes blazing with defiance. I had the cure, Gabe. An arsenic and sulfur compound that kills the parasite in the bloodstream if caught early enough, combined with an acaricide wash to kill the ticks on the hide. But no rancher back east would let a woman touch their livestock. I was chased out of Pennsylvania. I came west, looking for a desperate man with a dying ranch who had nothing left to lose. I needed a testing ground. She stood up, her breath pluming in the cold air. I lied to you, Gabe Montgomery. I used you for your land and your dying cattle. If you want to put me back on the stagecoach, I will go. But if you give me 2 weeks, I will save your ranch. Gabe looked from the intricate medical tools to the fierce, brilliant woman standing before him. The rugged mountain man felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of respect and intense, undeniable desire. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a fighter, just like him. Before Gabe could answer, the sharp crack of a breaking branch echoed from the timberline above. Gabe instantly raised his revolver, his instincts taking over. Riding out of the tree line were 4 men on horseback, wearing heavy dusters. At the center of the pack was Josiah Rutherford, his silver-tipped cane resting on his saddle horn, a smug, predatory smile stretching across his face. "Morning, Montgomery," Rutherford called out, eyeing the downed bull and the woman standing next to it. "Looks like the Reapers come to collect the last of your pride. I brought the deed transfer. Bank says you're officially in default by sundown. I'm here to take the broken ridge." Josiah Rutherford's laugh was a dry, rattling sound, like snake rattles in a tin can. He sat atop his polished black gelding, flanked by 3 hired guns whose hands rested menacingly on their holstered irons. Gabe didn't flinch. He stepped cleanly in front of Celine, his broad shoulders shielding her from Rutherford's predatory gaze. The heavy Colt in his hand remained leveled at Rutherford's chest. "You're trespassing, Josiah." Gabe's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate in the frigid air. "The bank ain't closed yet. Sundown is still 8 hours away." Rutherford sneered, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane. "A technicality, Montgomery. I've already paid off your markers at the Missoula National. The land is mine. I just came to offer you the courtesy of packing your wagon before my men toss your belongings into the snow. And I see you ordered yourself some comfort for your final days," he added, his eyes sliding over Gabe's shoulder to Celine. "Shame to drag a pretty little mail-order bride into your squalor." Before Gabe could cock the hammer of his revolver, Celine stepped out from behind him. She reached into her heavy wool coat and produced the loaded Remington Derringer Gabe hadn't realized she carried. She aimed it squarely at the bridge of Rutherford's nose. "Mr. Rutherford," Celine said, her voice ringing out with terrifying composure. "In Pennsylvania, we shoot trespassers who threaten our livestock and our husbands. I suggest you turn that horse around. If you return before the bank's official deadline, I will put a bullet through your eye and dissect what is left of your brain under my microscope." Rutherford's smug smile vanished. His hired men shifted nervously, unaccustomed to women who spoke of dissection and held their weapons without a tremor. Sundown on Friday, Rutherford spat, his face flushing with sudden rage. "I'll be back with Sheriff Ryman and a federal eviction notice. Enjoy your dead cows, Montgomery." He yanked his reins, and the 4 men galloped back up the timberline, disappearing into the shadows of the pines. Gabe slowly lowered his Colt, staring at his wife. The adrenaline was pumping hard through his veins, mixing with a profound, awestruck realization. "You would have shot him." "Without hesitation," Celine said, slipping the Derringer back into her coat. She picked up her leather satchel from the snow. "But bullets won't save this ranch, Gabe. We have 3 days until Friday. I need lumber, tar, and every able-bodied horse you have left. We are building a dipping vat. The next 72 hours were a grueling descent into sheer, agonizing labor. Gabe and Celine worked like possessed spirits. Following Celine's precise mathematical diagrams, Gabe used his immense strength and logging tools to dig a long, trench-like vat near the main corral, lining it with thick pine planks and sealing it with boiling pitch. While Gabe built the infrastructure, Celine transformed the ranch kitchen into a makeshift laboratory. She boiled massive iron cauldrons of water, meticulously measuring out toxic quantities of sulfur, arsenic trioxide, and sodium carbonate. The cabin smelled of brimstone and harsh chemicals, but Celine moved with the practiced grace of a master apothecary. On Wednesday morning, they began the roundup. Gabe rode Goliath to the point of exhaustion, driving the remaining 50 head of cattle toward the corral. Many were weak, stumbling, their hides crawling with the parasitic killers. Together, covered in mud, sweat, and the pungent chemical wash, they forced the cattle through the narrow chute and into the deep, foul-smelling vat. Gabe stood at the edge with a long wooden pole, gently but firmly pushing the cattle's heads under the surface for a split second to ensure total saturation. Just as Celine instructed, it was dangerous, back-breaking work. The arsenic wash burned their skin and stung their eyes. By Thursday night, the last calf had been pushed through the chute. Gabe collapsed onto the porch steps, his muscles screaming in protest. His hands blistered and stained yellow from the sulfur. The moon was high and cold. The ranch was eerily quiet. The screen door creaked. Celine stepped out, carrying a basin of warm water and a jar of homemade calendula salve. She looked exhausted, her mahogany hair escaping its pins, a smudge of soot across her cheek. To Gabe, she had never looked more beautiful. She knelt before him on the rough floorboards, taking his massive, battered hands in hers. She washed the caustic chemicals from his skin with a gentle, agonizing tenderness. "You believed in me," she whispered, her vibrant green eyes lifting to meet his. "Most men would have called me a witch or a madwoman. You trusted me with everything you had left. I trusted the woman who stood beside a dying bull and declared war," Gabe replied softly. His thumb reached out, brushing the soot from her cheek. The air between them, previously thick with the stench of chemicals and desperation, suddenly charged with an entirely different kind of electricity. Celine leaned into his touch. "Gabe." He didn't wait for her to finish. He leaned down, his mouth finding hers. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was desperate, fierce, and tasting of rain and survival. Celine kissed him back with equal hunger, her arms wrapping around his thick neck, anchoring herself to the mountain man who had given her a sanctuary, while he anchored himself to the brilliant woman who had given him hope. Friday morning broke over the Bitterroot Mountains, not with warmth, but with a brittle, crystalline cold that threatened to snap the heavy pine boughs in two. Gabe woke before the sun, his body aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The harsh scent of sulfur and pitch still clung to his skin, a lingering ghost of the brutal crucible they had just endured. He slipped out from beneath the heavy wool blankets, careful not to wake Celine, whose side of the bed was already empty. A knot of pure dread tightened in Gabe's gut as he pulled on his frosted boots. Today was the bank's deadline. If Celine's arsenic wash had failed, or if the sheer stress of the dipping vat had killed the weakened cattle overnight, Gabe had nothing left to defend his home with but lead and gunpowder. He trudged down the snow-packed trail toward the lower pasture, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. He stopped at the frozen, split-rail fence line, gripping the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to look. Thunder, the massive roan bull who had been drowning in his own fluids 3 days prior, was standing. He was gaunt, his ribs showing starkly against his flanks, and his hide was stained a sickly yellow from the chemical dip. But he was alive. He was tearing stubbornly at a patch of frozen winter wheat. Around him, the rest of the surviving herd was moving with purpose. The hollow, glazed look of impending death had vanished. The swollen, parasitic killers that had covered them were gone, leaving only shriveled, dead husks in the snow. Celine's impossible cure had worked. Gabe let out a jagged, shuddering breath, removing his wide-brimmed hat. For a decade, He had fought this land with brute strength, and it had nearly broken him. It took the brilliant mind of a woman from Pennsylvania to finally save him. He turned, desperate to find Celine, but a flash of movement near the timberline caught his eye. Celine wasn't at the cabin. She was kneeling in the mud near the geothermal runoff, a warm, natural spring that kept the lower watering hole from freezing over. She was oblivious to the miraculous recovery of the herd. Instead, she was hunched over her open leather satchel, a brass magnifying glass clutched in her gloved hand, staring intently at the muddy embankment. "We won, Celine," Gabe called out, his voice thick with raw emotion, his heavy boots crunching rapidly through the snow. "They're standing." The fever broke. Celine did not look up. Her face was pale and drawn tight with a terrifying cold fury. "It wasn't a fever, Gabe," she said, her voice carrying a sharpness that stopped him dead in his tracks. "And it wasn't a curse of the land." Gabe frowned, his joy evaporating, replaced by the honed instincts of a mountain man sensing a trap. "What are you talking about?" Celine pointed a trembling finger at the muddy bank of the warm spring. "I came down here at dawn to gather soil samples. I needed to understand how the Buphalus annulatus, the Texas tick, could possibly survive a Montana winter. I wrote to Dr. Theobald Smith in Washington about this very impossibility months ago. These parasites require a warm, southern climate. A hard freeze should kill them instantly." She stood up, kicking at a pile of dead brush piled unnaturally close to the water's edge. "They didn't survive the winter. They survived the spring." Gabe stepped closer, pulling the heavy brush aside. Buried beneath the dead pine needles were 3 massive burlap sacks, partially submerged in the steaming mud of the geothermal runoff. The stench hitting the cold air was putrid, the smell of rotting meat and stagnant blood. Gabe drew his hunting knife and slashed the nearest sack open. Hundreds of foul, rotting, tick-infested cattle hides spilled into the mud. "Someone deliberately brought infected hides up from the south," Celine said, her green eyes blazing. "They dumped them right at your water source, specifically targeting the warm mud where the larvae could hatch and attach themselves to your cattle. They seeded your ranch with a biological plague." Gabe stared at the rotting hides. The faded red ink stamped on the burlap sack seemed to burn into his retinas. Rutherford Cattle Co., Missoula. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together. The mysterious deaths. Rutherford's perfectly timed buyout offers the aggressive isolation of the broken ridge. It was warfare, waged by a coward in a tailored suit. "I am going to kill him," Gabe growled, his voice stripped of all humanity. "I'm going to ride into Missoula, drag Josiah Rutherford into the street, and put a bullet through his heart." "No, you are not," Celine shouted, grabbing his thick arm. "If you shoot him, Gabe, you hang. He takes the ranch, and I become a widow before I've even truly become a wife. We are going to use the law. I have the scientific proof. We will summon U.S. Marshal Beidler, if we have to." By high noon, the valley echoed with the rumble of a heavy carriage. Josiah Rutherford arrived exactly as promised. He was flanked by 3 heavily armed hired guns, a nervous-looking bank manager named Thaddeus Boone, and Sheriff Thomas Ryman. Gabe and Celine stood waiting on the wide wooden porch. Gabe had his Winchester rifle resting casually over his broad shoulder. Celine stood beside him, holding a locked wooden box. "Time's up, Montgomery," Rutherford called out cheerfully, stepping down from his carriage. "Sheriff Ryman is here to serve the federal eviction paperwork. Mr. Boone has the deed transfer. I expect you off the property by nightfall." Sheriff Ryman, an honest but tired man, stepped forward with a heavy sigh. "I'm sorry, Gabe. The bank says you missed the final payment window. I have to ask you to vacate." "I ain't vacating, Tom," Gabe said calmly, "because the debt is fraudulent, born from the malicious destruction of private property." Rutherford threw his head back and laughed. "Destruction of property? The man has lost his mind." Celine stepped forward, her boots echoing sharply on the floorboards. "My name is Celine Miller," she announced, her voice carrying the crisp cadence of a seasoned academic. "Former lead biological researcher for the United States Bureau of Animal Industry. I have spent the last 3 days curing this herd of a parasitic infestation. Rutherford's smug smile faltered. Celine unlocked her wooden box, pulled out a heavy, soil-stained burlap sack, and dropped it squarely at Sheriff Ryman's feet. An infestation caused by these hides. We found 3 of these sacks buried in the geothermal mud near our watering hole. They served as an incubator. The stench of rot hit the air, causing Banker Boone to gag. Notice the brand on the sack, Tom, Gabe pointed out. Sheriff Ryman looked down, his eyes widening as he read the red stamp. Rutherford Cattle Co. He looked up, his hand slowly drifting toward his holster. Josiah, what in God's name is this? It's a lie, Rutherford stammered, his face draining of blood. She planted that rubbish. I also found wagon tracks leading from the drop site directly back to your private rail cars. Celine pressed on. My microscopic analysis, fully documented, proves these ticks are native to Texas. A federal circuit judge will be very interested to know you are intentionally transporting quarantined biological material across state lines to commit extortion. Rutherford realized the trap had violently snapped shut. The penalty for intentionally spreading Texas fever wasn't a fine. It was federal prison. Shoot them! Rutherford screamed, his composure shattering. He frantically reached inside his heavy wool duster for his hidden derringer. Gabe moved with the explosive, terrifying speed of a mountain cat. He didn't bother leveling the heavy Winchester. He launched himself off the porch, swinging the solid walnut stock in a brutal upward arc, catching Rutherford flush under the jaw just as the man cleared his weapon. There was a sickening crack. Rutherford crumpled to the frozen dirt, out cold. Hands in the air, boys! Sheriff Ryman roared, drawing his 6-shooter in the blink of an eye. Drop the iron right now! The 3 hired men, looking at their unconscious boss, and realizing a federal hanging was in their future, wisely let their gun belts fall to the snow. Gabe stood over Rutherford's motionless body, his chest heaving. The blinding rage slowly bled out into the cold mountain air, replaced by profound relief. He turned and looked back at Celine. She hadn't flinched. She had stared the devil in the eye, and beaten him with nothing but glass slides and sheer courage. Sheriff, Gabe said, a genuine smile breaking through his thick beard. I believe you have some trespassing trash to haul off my property. The Broken Ridge Ranch didn't just survive. It became the most prosperous spread in the Bitterroot Valley. Gabe and Celine built a legacy on healthy cattle and unbreakable trust. Celine published her groundbreaking research, forever altering Western veterinary science. Together, they tamed the rugged frontier, not with bullets alone, but with intellect, relentless courage, and a profound love forged in the fires of an unforgiving, bitter Montana winter.